live in just a few moments. Really go live. We are now live, and I'm going to start the countdown clock. The next thing I'm going to do is share my screen, and you're going to see the countdown clock like so. And we still have 2 minutes to go, but there are people who are already online who can hear us and even see us at this point, even though we haven't officially started. So we're just about ready. The countdown clock, as you know, will run for 10 minutes. And while it's running, people can actually, they'll see, I think you may notice two tiny little windows where we are, and the audio goes through. So people know it's not part of the official program, but they'll be able to hear us anyway.
Oh, that's good. Well, your very able production assistant brought me a bottle of sparkling mineral water.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
It's a very high-end operation.
Okay, time to start the countdown. Did I ever tell you that I designed this animated rainbow yin yang?
You didn't have to tell me, it's obvious. I think you should copyright it. And
I have
sell it
copyrighted
to Apple or Microsoft.
I've copyrighted over 700 different versions, which is this animation includes 720
I think it's much nicer than the little circles that Apple uses, or what does Microsoft use, like an hourglass, right?
I'm not even sure, Andrew.
I may have that backwards. Or maybe they both use the circle. It's the little dots in a circle. This is much more pleasing.
Did I ever give you one of our rainbow yin yang pins?
Yes, you did.
Okay. Now what I should do is,
well, I see the king of both the upper and lower kingdom here. I don't know exactly why he's green.
what are you referring to?
I'm looking at this print on your wall, and it looks like Anubis is weighing the deeds of a soul against a feather.
That's correct, yes. That's a famous scene from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So one of our earliest
It looks like the feather is winning.
That's the point, that the heart needs to be, that's what is in that little jar is his heart. And
well, the feather appears to be a bit heavier.
That's the point. That's the feather of truth, of Ma'at. And the point is that his heart is lighter than a feather. So that means he can enter into paradise.
Oh, I had it backwards here. I thought it was his virtue was lighter than a feather, but it's actually the other way around. Okay.
Yeah, that's what it is. His heart. Well,
What
there's
does the
some,
green-faced pharaoh of the upper and lower kingdom have to do with any of it?
that's Osiris, who is the Lord of the dead.
Well, he's wearing the
Double crown.
double crown of the upper and lower kingdom.
Yes, he was the pharaoh, according
I
to
guess by
legend.
lower, they really mean lower, huh?
Yeah. In this case, yes.
Yeah.
He's the lord of the underworld. And he's a mummy. That's why he is wrapped up in.
Yes, he is.
Uh-huh. So he's presiding over paradise.
Attended by two attractive young ladies.
Yeah. Now, for people who are listening and maybe don't know what we're talking about, it's the scene called the weighing of the heart from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. That Andrew is sitting at my desk, and I have a large papyrus framed above my desk with that scene. Wait, something happened with this timer. Did I accidentally push it back? We have 5 minutes to go, and it's saying 9 minutes. I must have accidentally.
Brother.
There, really, there's only about 4 minutes left.
But
there.
Here is the picture I was looking at.
Haha, you took a picture of it on your iPad.
Yes, I did.
Okay, for those who are curious, they can only see it.
And the dog-headed god, or the alligator-headed dog god, I mean?
That's a creature. It's part alligator, part lion, and part hippopotamus. And if the heart were heavier than a feather, then that creature would eat the deceased person, and that would be the end of him.
So it is your virtue that brings you into paradise, or is it your devotion?
Well, there's some controversy around that. Actually, there are different interpretations of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Some people have suggested that it doesn't matter what sins the person committed, as long as they have, when they enter paradise, they are the part of themselves that was the observer rather than the actor, and it's totally detached from the action. So the heart is light. And others say, no, you're being judged based on how you behaved in life. But I think it's the Egyptian mindset was much more complex.
Yeah, I noticed you had a different piece in the house that appeared to be atomist with the sun disk and so on. Not that I have an educated eye for such things, but I did see a movie once about it.
Oh. Okay, so we're going to actually start the program in less than 2 minutes. And let me see if I can. Okay, hello and welcome, everybody. We are now live. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. I'm glad to be here with my younger brother, Andrew. Andrew is an attorney. He's visiting from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is where we grew up. It's where Andrew went to high school, and he went to college in Wisconsin. I went to college in Wisconsin too, but I grew up in Fond du Lac, and it was only after I left home and went off to college in Madison that our family moved to Milwaukee, which is now Andrew's home. So we're going to talk about who knows what at this point. Andrew is a very experienced criminal defense attorney. If you have questions about DUIs and about the law and about if you're in trouble legally, what you need to do, Andrew can answer those questions. He's also—
I'm not going to give any legal advice.
Oh, okay, but you could give sort of general advice, I would think.
Happy to give general information, no specific legal advice. It comes with a disclaimer. Lawyers are good at disclaimers.
But we might also talk about, and I think our viewers are curious about our family background. And just so you know, Andrew and viewers, the very first live stream event that we held is one in which I talked about our parents and what it was like for me growing up in Wisconsin. So some of the viewers who watched that live stream, which was about 2 years ago or so, will be familiar with that. Janelle, my wonderful wife, has also been a live stream guest. So our viewers have a sense of her. And I know some viewers have told me they're curious about my family. They're curious about what it took to become a parapsychologist of all things. And just this morning, I did have an insight about the fact that I started out my graduate career in Berkeley in criminology. I was doing group therapy in San Quentin prison in the psychiatric unit with murderers and rapists. And I gave all that up when I decided to focus on the positive side of human deviance instead of the negative. But you, as your work, as I recall, you started out your career as a public defender. And now you specialize in DUI. You're the president of the DUI college at this point in time. So you have immersed yourself in the world that I left, which is a world of, let's say, negative human deviance.
Well, I certainly deal with the seamier side of life very often. I've handled many different kinds of criminal cases over the decades. I am a board certified specialist in the defense of impaired driving, and I'm the president of that national board, in fact. And I do deal with the kind of human problems that lead to criminal behavior, but my perspective on it is far different than a criminologist's perspective, which is how do we address the individual and social problems that cause this antisocial behavior. My perspective on it is really the relationship of individuals to their government, and when the weight and power of the most powerful institution maybe on earth, the United States government and the state governments, are brought to bear against individual people, what is the proper and just way for that to occur? We have an adversarial system where people have a right to be heard and tell their story and argue their case, and that's what I do. It's an unusual system, by the way. Most countries don't have it.
Okay, I'm just getting set up. Here we go. We've got questions coming in. And the first question is from Chris Scarpantonio. I should put on my glasses so I can make sure I'm reading everything correctly. Do you guys ever poke fun at each other in regards to parapsychology? Chris asks.
Well, I spent most of last night at a dinner party doing that to Jeffrey. Wouldn't you say so? I think I'm more skeptical and more, what's the term, materialist and philosophical bent than you are, Jeffrey. And yeah, I tease him all the
time. Okay. And I've got another question coming in from Emmy Vadnais, who is co-host now with me of New Thinking Aloud and is very active as a moderator and an indispensable member of our team, who asks, Andrew, what is your favorite childhood memory with Jeffrey?
Jeffrey is 8 years older than me. And when I was 10, he went off to college. And that's a big gap between siblings, 8 years. So he was really, we weren't best buddies as children. My favorite childhood memories. Jeffrey had this little room in the attic of the house. We lived in a big old drafty Victorian house, all beat up. And there was this little side room in the attic. He called it his cubby hole. And he had children's chemistry sets in there and toy telescopes. And he had all sorts of really cool stuff in there. And if I wasn't too much trouble and I wouldn't break anything, he'd let me hang out with him while he played with his chemistry set or his science experiments and stuff like that. And I'm very fond of those memories. Jeffrey taught me how to ride a bicycle. I remember that. He ran behind me holding the seat as I pedaled. And at some point I said, don't let go, don't let go. And he said, I haven't been holding you for a half a block. And I love bicycles. Bicycles and bicycling have been a major theme in my life, and they still are. And the first time I ever pedaled a bicycle, Jeffrey taught me how to do it without training wheels, I might add. As a small child, those are my favorite memories. As an adolescent, when I was maybe 13 years old, Jeffrey took me to Chicago and we marched in an anti-Vietnam War demonstration with maybe 100,000 people. That was a pretty big deal as a 13-year-old. There are others.
Yeah, how nice to dredge up some of those memories. Elizabeth Lord, who is another one of our volunteers, asks, what did you think when Jeff decided to pursue his career in parapsychology, and what do you think about it now?
Jeffrey is my hero, always has been. My much bigger older brother, who is not only an intimate friend, my blood, we're inseparable, but also sort of this distant icon to me because of the 8-year difference. And he's always been brilliant and acclaimed. So when Jeffrey left his job in the criminal justice system and pursued parapsychology, the whole family was bursting our buttons with pride, and we still are. Which is not to say that I am above arguing with Jeffrey vociferously about philosophy of science or such things, which I think we both have fun with.
Okay, and here's a question from one of our other volunteers, Laura Newbert, who asks you, what was your most difficult case and why?
How much time do we have for this? That's the story I told last night at dinner.
Oh, yeah, that was a very powerful story, but give it 5 minutes. Let's see what you can do in 5 minutes.
I represented a very disadvantaged 15-year-old boy who was charged in adult court with murder. He was a tiny, childlike guy and borderline mentally retarded, not because of any organic problem just because of the cultural deprivation he had grown up with. Um, he had uh, gone along on a joyride with a bunch of his
We're having an
teenage,
internet problem here.
early adolescent friends with some adults.
Yeah, we're
They adults
experiencing
in the
trouble.
early
We're
20s.
having, oh, Andrew, we're having a difficulty here. I can see you.
I'm back, but I lost you first.
Okay, yeah, we missed everything due to the unstable internet connection. I would recommend you start over.
Well, that's good. Consider it a rehearsal. I'll tell the story more. I represented a young man. He was 15 years old, a child. He didn't have a beard. He was maybe under 100 pounds. He was charged as an adult with murder. He was roped into it by some thugs that were in their early 20s who put a gun in his hand and told him to go rob a comic book store in Milwaukee. He got frightened and he pulled the trigger and he killed the owner of the comic book store, who was a wonderful man, a former officer in the Iranian army in the 1970s, meaning the Shah's army. He was a refugee from the Iranian Revolution who came to America and applied his trade as a comic book salesman. It was a horrible tragedy for all the families, except for this little boy. Really didn't have a family. He had no one to support him. He was alone. The adults who were the masterminds of this, who used these children as puppets, cut deals and got off basically with a slap on the wrist. A few years. But the government wanted this 15-year-old boy badly because he did pull the trigger. I thought it was a horrible injustice. We went to trial. The trial was utterly horrible, as you might imagine. The graphic descriptions of the murder from eyewitnesses. The jury was even bussed to the crime scene to look at it. It was just a terrible experience. What was even worse about it was that in the 9 months or so that the case was pending, this tiny little childlike 15-year-old boy had a growth spurt. And he was, 5'10", 175 pounds, growing a beard by the time the jury saw him as a very threatening, fear-inspiring man instead of the child that he actually was. And I did everything I could for him, but I couldn't do it. He was convicted. The judge had the option. The only sentence was life, but the judge could have given the prison authorities the permission to parole him. Not that he had to be paroled, but they might have agreed to release him in 13 years if he had earned it in the prison, although there was no guarantee that would happen. I did everything I could to convince the judge that was appropriate, and it was clearly appropriate. And this child who had no one was given life with no parole at the age of 16. It haunted me for decades. I went and visited him once in prison. I'm not sure he remembered me. It was the most horrible injustice I've ever seen. And I've seen other injustices, believe me, civil and criminal. It was just wrong that the government was going to chew up and spit out a child like this for something that he didn't plan. It was something he got caught up in. Not that he should have walked out the door a free man, but life with no parole. 23 years later, a wonderful attorney named Melinda Schwartz in Milwaukee took up his cause and convinced the prosecutor's office to give him another chance, and he was paroled. And I assisted with that as best I could, and I was delighted she did it. And he got paroled, and now I believe he's in some sort of assisted living for people with mental health problems, leading a life of some dignity. One of the things that moved me about it, we talked about it last night, was when I saw him maybe 5 years after he was convicted, it seemed like he didn't even remember me. Who are you and why are you here? Seemed to be his attitude. But 18 years after that, now 23 years after the trial, when I spoke with Melinda about it, his new attorney, she told me he remembered that. He spoke about it in detail, and it was very important to him that he wasn't forgotten. So that's the story. That was the worst case I ever saw in my life.
Okay, I'm going to continue with a few more questions from Laura Newbert, because I think they're excellent questions. She asks, what are your thoughts about the very strict DUI laws, and do you believe they encourage anger with police authority?
That's a complex question, and the answer is complex. My answer is two parts. Criminal laws are passed by the legislature of individual states, and that's supposed to represent the will of the people who elected them. And it's supposed to represent the judgment and wisdom of the legislators who have all sorts of resources to study these issues. So I think that one of the, maybe the biggest problem we have as a society, one of them anyway, is the problem of addiction and the failure of government to address it as what it is, which is a disease that afflicts people. And sometimes that means that people who act out addictively need to be punished. I'm not opposed to that. I'm not saying treatment instead of punishment. Not that at all. I respect and I have no problem with strict DUI laws if they represent the considered wisdom of the society and the legislators. What I don't like is when any crime, whether it's sexual assault or guns or drunk driving, become political issues, and demagogues use that in order to drum up fears in society and get votes and maintain power. And I see that all too often. So I'm in favor of strict DUI laws. But when we make that judgment as a society that we're going to have strict penalties for things, we also need to make sure that the rights of anybody who's accused of that are scrupulously honored. And because of what I think is the demagoguery and fear-mongering for decades, all of our rights have been under attack. The notions of presumption of innocence, the right to remain silent, the right to confront and cross-examine your accusers, even the right to an attorney, the right to a jury trial, all of those things are under attack. And I'm very much opposed to that. I hope that answers the question.
It does. And we've got yet another question I want to bring up from Laura Newbert, who asks, are you a Green Bay Packers fan?
And there is no joy in Mudville today because Mighty Casey struck out. I'm a Green Bay Packers owner. Yes.
Maybe you could explain what you mean by a Green Bay Packers owner, because people outside of Wisconsin may have no idea about the influence of the Packers within that state.
Well, in the early days of the National Football League, when owning a football team was not necessarily financially viable, and it could be very risky. Most of the teams went under and went bankrupt. And they no longer survive. And they were small town teams in places like Scranton or Kalamazoo or places like that. And Green Bay was one of those teams, a small industrial town that had a football team. And the team went broke a bunch of times. So the owner, a guy by the founder of the team, a fellow by the name of Curly Lambeau, concocted this scheme to keep the team alive. He created a private nonprofit corporation and floated non-voting, powerless, non-transferable stock. So you could buy a share of stock in the team got the money, but you had no rights whatsoever as an owner. You couldn't sell the stock. You didn't have voting rights. It was just a souvenir, a donation to the team. But there was also a proviso that since it was a private nonprofit corporation, Curly Lambeau could no longer own it. And he couldn't hold any more stock in it than anybody else. So, and if there's a provision that if the corporation was ever liquidated, the proceeds of the sale would be donated to the veterans of foreign wars. That's so the Green Bay Packers are the only major league sports team in the world that is a private nonprofit corporation owned by the people of the community who purchased that stock. And there's been, over the decades, 3 occasions where they floated that stock. There's about 250,000 stockholders. It entitles us to nothing more than a stock certificate, a souvenir to put on our walls, and I am one of them. And we get to go to the annual meeting. That's it. So the Green Bay Packers are the only nonprofit major league sports team in the universe, as far as I know.
Okay, now we have a number of questions from other viewers. Ruth Crawford asks, is it true Jeff was a long-haired hippie at Berkeley?
Absolutely true. Yes. I think he still would be, but for circumstances.
Here's a question from Chuta Beam, who asks you, who is your favorite philosopher and which philosophy inspired you most about life?
Well, I have a degree in philosophy. The philosophers I studied and influenced me the most were philosophers of science, like Thomas Kuhn or Karl Popper, which are certainly not esoteric or even spiritual. That's the answer to the question. In other words,
okay.
Yeah.
I've got a question here from Peter Deutsch, who asks you, as a criminal defender, how do you reconcile anger with compassion? And do you draw strength from the unseen?
Thank you for that question. Starting with the first part, I think one of the functions of a criminal justice system in any social organization is to manage anger. If we didn't have a justice system, if somebody felt wronged or if a family felt wronged, they would be angry, resentful, and they would seek retribution. And an organized social system, even if it's a tribe, let's say as small as 50 people, we just cannot live that way. We can't exist by ourselves as individuals, and tribes can't exist without some system to give retribution, if you will, to people who have been victimized in a just way, so that there isn't war and constant conflict internally. So I honor that. And I think that's a legitimate function of the criminal justice system, which is more and more and more recognized. The whole victims' rights movement, I think, part of it is to give victims a voice. And I think that's just fine. As a criminal defense lawyer, my job is to tell my client's story. And sometimes my clients are innocent and wrongfully accused. Sometimes, like that young man I spoke about earlier, the 15-year-old, they're guilty, but they have a really important story that needs to be told. And as a young lawyer, I had what I now believe is a wrong opinion, but I took the view that a lawyer, especially a courtroom lawyer, was like a surgeon. You had to remain emotionally divorced from what you were doing in order to maintain objectivity and do a good job, which I think probably describes a surgeon doing surgery on a human being. You don't think of them as a person, you think of them as the systems you're operating on. And I thought that was a good model to be an attorney. I've totally rejected that point of view as I've gotten older. I now feel that no matter how heinous the behavior of my client, I have to find a place of compassion and empathy that's authentic. I have to find their true story, not make up some excuses, but find the true story, the authentic story, and I have to tell it, whatever it may be. And it requires you, the last part of your question was, how does the unseen go into this? I'm a student of a school of lawyering now that's taught at an institution called the Trial Lawyers College, which is criminal defense lawyers, civil lawyers, whomever. And the foundation of this school is that self-knowledge, authenticity, self-actualization are absolutely inherent to the courtroom process. Because if you are a person who is not honest with yourself about who you are and actively working on yourself and being authentic about your flaws and your character defects, then you're not, if you're inauthentic in the courtroom about yourself, you can never authentically tell somebody else's story. So we spend time essentially in therapy doing personal psychodramas as a foundation of learning how to be lawyers in the courtroom. So we do try to tap into the most profound and compassionate human emotions and parts of the human experience in order to convey that, to speak for our clients, no matter what they've done. And I was really hoping somebody would ask me a question where I could talk about that. So thank you.
What a beautiful answer, Andrew. Brian Kramer asks, Andrew, have you had any unusual parapsychological experiences in life?
I don't think I've had any paralogical experiences that were unusual. I think I've had maybe some experiences that were ordinary. We discussed last night when my son Benjamin died, which was 15 years ago. I had a dream of him after we buried him, which I don't claim by any rational or scientific way, but just I feel it, that he came to me. I have had moments in my life where I needed to pray to a deity that I didn't logically believe in. After all, I'm trained in the philosophy of science, and yet my prayers were answered. I view that as miraculous. I feel a divine presence that guides me, but I would never make a logical argument or scientific argument that that's true, but I feel it. So that's me.
Okay, and I want to share with you a comment that has come in from Chris Rattle, who wants to thank you, Andrew, for your humanity and decency. And he says, we need people like you in this world. Good job, my friend.
Well, I'm humbled and honored that you would say such a thing. That's touching to me. Thank you.
Here is a question from Suzanne Taylor, a friend, who says, do they teach in law school the way Norway does it, where rehabilitation is the object over punishment? If we, quote, got it, it would change the world to be about compassion and not vengeance.
In American law schools, the short answer is no, they don't teach that. I think in some law schools, they may teach about it. Certainly some law professors may espouse it. I had a law professor who taught, and he was adamant that there were 4 public policies underlying the criminal justice system: prevention, rehabilitation, punishment, and retribution. And he felt that by far the most weighty policy was just punishment. Deterrence and retribution, not punishment and retribution. Prevention, rehabilitation, deterrence, and retribution. And he felt that deterrence was by far the most important policy. And he didn't believe that rehabilitation even worked, that all of society's efforts to rehabilitate addicts and people with criminal thought issues were an utter failure. I don't subscribe to that, and I don't think any of my classmates did, but that's what I was taught at the University of Wisconsin Law School.
Okay. Here is a question from Rafael Reyes, who asks, if you could time travel anywhere to the past and represent somebody in court, who would it be?
If I could have been the lawyer in any case, I will answer the question. Give me a moment. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were convicted of espionage and executed in the 1950s for being communists and selling atomic secrets to the Russians, or giving them, I think, more than selling them. It was done for ideology, allegedly, not greed. And I think it's likely that Julius at least was guilty. But it happened at the height of the Cold War. Anti-Semitism at that point in our history was focused on communism being sort of a Jewish ideology. And the Rosenbergs were the symbol of that for a couple of years in American history. And this husband and wife with an infant child or a toddler child, if I recall correctly, were executed. And I don't think that I would have been happy to speak for them. I would have been proud to. I could give you a lot of other examples. The Scarborough boys, a couple of African Americans in Alabama who were convicted and imprisoned for just about their entire lives for rape of two white women, both of whom denied it occurred at trial. They had several trials where these two women said it never happened. There was never any testimony from the so-called victims that they were raped. And yet these guys were convicted in Montgomery, Alabama, I believe, several times. And the prosecution's theory was that Jews had bribed these women to lie. And it was a wonderful lawyer who represented those guys, but it was destined to fail. And I would love to have been that lawyer. And there are other lawyers who I look up to. I wish I could sit in their chair. I can't imagine the stress they were under, but yeah. How's that?
That was excellent. And I've got a question from Wes A, who asks, have you ever had a psychedelic experience?
I plead the fifth. Even though the statute of limitations ran decades ago. Not in my adult life.
Okay. Here's a question from Chris Rattle again. What do you think about medical marijuana patients? Should they walk then or what?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't hear it.
Yeah, he asked, should medical marijuana patients walk then or what?
I still don't understand. Should medical marijuana patients?
I think he means probably people who've been convicted of marijuana crimes, but were using it for medical purposes.
All right. My opinion on that is maybe a little contrary to the conventional wisdom right now. And I want to acknowledge that much of what I know about that issue, I've learned from a wonderful lawyer who knows more about it than anybody else I know, a man from Seattle named George Bianchi. As I understand it, and my numbers could be off, but something like 36 of the 50 states now have legalized medical marijuana, and a minority of states, it's up now, I think over 15, maybe 15 to 20 now have legal recreational marijuana. And I acknowledge, frankly, that in the 1920s, when marijuana was outlawed in the United States by the federal government and most of the states, the impetus for that was simply the cultural revolution, if you will, of the Jazz Age, the influence of people of color on American popular culture, and the fear-mongering and racism associated with the popularity of cannabis among people of color. So it was a racist thing to begin with, and its application and the prohibition of it has been a disaster for American policy and racist in its inception and application. Having said that, I, unlike many of my people, don't really support legalization of recreational marijuana. I think we already have too much of an alcohol and drug problem in this country, and I don't see that making drugs more available helps anything. However, you asked about medical marijuana. I certainly, if somebody with glaucoma or chronic pain is living in a non-medical marijuana state or has a criminal conviction for possession of marijuana, and they're able to make out a factual case that it was not recreational use, I think that they should get some kind of clemency. And I noticed that President Biden the other day just did something to that effect. I don't know the details, but I believe he offered clemency to every federal prisoner in federal custody or on federal status at present time for marijuana. And I think that's good. In general, prohibition has never worked in American society. And if marijuana is a gateway drug, and I don't know that it is, but let's assume it is, the proper way to deal with that is with social education and rehabilitation and treatment of the disease of addiction.
Okay, here's a question from Chuta Beam, who asks, what would you do if you were assigned a case? And I know you don't get assigned cases, you get to choose now, but this is the question. If you were assigned a case, perhaps in the days when you were a public defender, that you were morally opposed to?
I would do my duty without hesitation or qualms. In other words, if I'm morally opposed to the behavior of my client, would I still defend him? If I'm understanding, I'll interpret the correctness. Somebody has done something that I find absolutely abhorrent. Let's think of some of the worst things. Somebody has raped a child. I can't think of much worse than that. Yes, I would still defend that person because everybody is a human being that deserves to have a voice no matter what they've done. And we have a system where everybody is presumed innocent and nobody has to prove themselves innocent, but it's the responsibility of the government to follow appropriate rules, afford everybody due process of law. And I won't list all the components of that again. I've already done that. And that's a really important part of it. If the most despicable people in our society, people who would commit crimes against children, are not afforded fair treatment and are not given due process of law, not given a right to be heard and tell their story, if we deprive those people of that, then we are all deprived of it. And so, yes, I would absolutely do it, and I would do it proudly. What I would not do would be to lie for them, or do something deceitful for them, or do something unethical for them. Never.
Okay. Very good answer. Andrei Slavosh Krasowski asks, are you interested in problems of philosophy of law, like the controversy between legal positivism and the theory of natural law?
I'm interested in it. In general, we call that, this subject is called jurisprudence. At least that's what we're taught to call it. And I regret that since I became a practicing lawyer, I have not studied that for many decades. So I find the topic fascinating, but I can't speak about it at an educated level anymore.
Okay. Here's a question from Anton Michael Swanapoel. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Who asks, if someone who committed vehicular manslaughter while high and blame it on having had to be self-medicated at the time, does this exempt them in any way for being under the influence and first degree? I guess they're talking about first degree murder.
Oh, that is a great question. And that really is kind of in the wheelhouse of what I do for a living. So first of all, the laws on that are different in every state. There are commonalities, but every state and every state legislature passes their own laws on the subject of vehicular homicide by impaired use of a motor vehicle. So let's take different examples. We can have the case of somebody who is using illegal recreational drugs or drugs they've obtained illegally, and they're clearly impaired. So let's say somebody has a self-diagnosed anxiety disorder, and they have bought Xanax, an anti-anxiety drug, on the street, and they're driving high, and they are at fault in an accident and someone dies. I don't think there's any state that would excuse that or allow that and consider it a defense that the person wasn't attempting to get high, they were attempting to self-medicate a condition. And in fact, let's say that they were diagnosed with it, but were self-medicating. I don't think that would be excused anywhere. So let's go to the other side of the spectrum. A person has an anxiety disorder. A doctor prescribes them lorazepam, Xanax. They take the Xanax, they have an unexpected reaction to it, fall asleep at the wheel, and somebody is killed. So now we have somebody who's not using it recreationally. They're taking it as prescribed. It has an unexpected side effect. Would that excuse that behavior? And I would argue, yes, it should. However, every state has different rules on that. And in my home state, Wisconsin, it's a gray area. So I go in and argue it often. And then we have a lot of cases kind of in the middle. What happens if they've had a beer or some alcohol with their Xanax? In my home state, then that defense is clearly disallowed. Other states might see it differently. Here's another one. What about the sleeping pill Ambien, which is known to cause somnambulism, sleepwalking? And people will do things unconsciously under the influence of Ambien that are not volitional acts. They will eat, they will have sex, they will walk around, they will drive cars without having any conscious volition of doing it. And again, I would say that those people have not committed a crime, and yet that's very controversial in the law, and that defense is not universally recognized. So to take it, I'm almost done with the answer, Jeffrey, to take it to a more sociological rather than technical level, we as a society have put an awful lot of power in the hands of the medical profession, and we label people as ill or needing medical help and treat those conditions with medication. And that's just, there's a huge bureaucracy and a huge part of our economy that's devoted to that. And yet when something goes wrong, rather than thinking, you know, we have a sick person here who's caught up in a healthcare system where they're medicated, instead of dealing with it as a social problem, we just take people and throw them in prison for being sick and following their doctor's orders. Now, maybe the doctor's orders, in fact, I would say almost always the doctor's orders are ill-advised and over-medicating. But does that matter? I think it's a social problem that is unaddressed.
Okay, I'm getting a lot of very good questions from Chuda Beam, who has also asked, how can we improve the legal system?
All right. I think first of all, I revere the American legal system. I think it is unquestionably the most sophisticated, fairest system on earth at this point. Because more than any other country on earth, we protect the right to a jury trial where these decisions are not made by government bureaucrats, but by citizens, for better or for worse sometimes. And we have a system where theoretically the lowest of the low, the person who's sleeping on a piece of cardboard in a doorway, has the same rights as the highest of the high. the highest government official, the President of the United States, is no higher in the law than the guy sleeping in the doorway. That's how it's supposed to be, but that's not how it is in application. In fact, powerful institutions, corporations, and people with money get a much better deal in our system. And I think our system should apply a lot more resources to equality of justice. Public defenders are woefully underfunded. Small legal problems that might heavily affect a person of limited means, like landlord-tenant law or consumer law, where a landlord wrongfully evicts somebody or withholds their security deposit, or consumer law where you're ripped off by the car dealer who sells you a lemon and won't give you a refund. Our society does not protect individual people the way they should in those situations. The high and the mighty have disproportionate power. So that's one side of it. The other side is in criminal law. In my going on 42 years of experience now, I would say 80% of the crimes that happen in society happen secondary to some kind of problem of drug addiction. And I include alcohol in that, usually alcohol, but other drugs. And as a society, we have yet to face that problem and apply appropriate resources to deal with it.
Okay, here's a question from Christopher, who asks, Andrew, do you believe in capital punishment?
No. No. And it's not a matter of justice. I see how there are crimes that are so vicious and so despicable that maybe the only just answer is an eye for an eye. But that, if I may put it in maybe simplistic terms, that's a decision for God, not for man. Our systems are far too imperfect to fairly administer capital punishment. And that's true in every state I've seen it. It disproportionately affects people of color and the poor. There's no question about that. And there's also zero evidence. In fact, the data clearly shows it has zero deterrent effect. So even in a situation where it's the only fair result, I don't believe our justice system is competent or should be allowed to do that. I don't believe our government should have the power of life and death over individual people.
Okay, and a question from Rafael Reyes. What is a law that you think is good, that if you could, you would have put it into law 100 years ago?
Workman's compensation was put into law 100 years ago in the state of Wisconsin, but there's a good example. A law that exists now that didn't exist 100 years ago. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which was enacted when, in the late 1990s, which finally gave disabled people who are in wheelchairs or children who have hearing impairment or learning disorders, finally gave them some sense of fair treatment, where they even had to, now we don't think twice about them. There's wheelchair ramps to get into public places, and toilets that people in wheelchairs can use. But 30 years ago, people who were disabled were the lowest of the low, outcasts in society, and treated despicably, without any dignity. And I think the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed into law by George Bush the Elder, was one of the greatest civil rights acts in our country. Another one would be the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which were which were enacted 100 years too late. They were enacted in 1968. They should have been enacted in 1868.
Good answers. And I'm getting a lot of positive feedback, Andrew. Somebody named Wes says this is quickly becoming one of my favorite interviews. And Christopher writes, this is already a great interview. I'm so glad to hear this live stream. You are a real hero. Genuinely. So here's a question from Peter Deutsch. Before I ask the question, I'll just say briefly, we're getting close to the top of the hour. We're going to continue until the bottom of the hour, another 35 minutes. Peter Deutsch.
Before you do that, Jeffrey, I want to interrupt.
Okay. Yeah.
This last comment and I'm honored and grateful and gratified that you compliment me and Sam a hero, but I want you to know I'm no different than 999 out of 1,000 of my colleagues, hundreds, tens of thousands of them around the country practicing law. And I belong to organizations. I have the honor of being the president of the National College for DUI Defense, and I'm a member of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and the Trial Lawyers College. There are tens of thousands, well, that's probably an overstatement, but many thousands of very heroic criminal defense lawyers working at this in the trenches every day, and they do not, in my view, get the respect and honor that they deserve. So I'm very grateful for your comment, but no, it's not me. I'm just one of many.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I think it's fair to say that lawyers as a profession are probably not the most respected profession in our society. And I wonder what you think about that in general, the reputation of the legal profession.
I have a personal ethos of representing individual people who are in disputes with large institutions, whether it's governments or insurance companies. Those are, insurance companies are very powerful institutions when any individual has a dispute with them. So, and I think you can see I believe in the honor of that. At the same time, I have to deal with attorneys on the other side who represent those large institutions. And I see that for the most part, they try to do their work with integrity. And I think they believe the same thing about my side. There are bad apples for sure on all sides. And I've seen them and I know them on my side. And I've seen them and I know them on the other side, as there are in any profession. But surely over hundreds of years, lawyers are the butt of many jokes, some of which are even good jokes. I think society sees us as, there's a segment of society that sees us as sort of professional liars, or we take guilty people and make them look innocent. And that's just a misconception. That's nuts. That's like saying that an oncologist who treats people suffering from cancer, profit off of cancer, and that's their ethos. And that's not true at all. They're people dedicated to easing human suffering.
Okay, now I'm going to come back to the question from Peter Deutsch that I started to ask earlier. And he asks, should individuals hold themselves accountable for the collective crimes of our own government?
Jeffrey, can you ask the listener or viewer, or can you yourself tell me what is meant by hold themselves accountable?
I'm not able to question Peter Deutsch directly on that. He might have something to post, but I imagine that many people out there feel guilty. I think there are people I know who feel guilty because of slavery, even though it ended more than 150 years ago, for example, because the ramifications of that era are still being felt. And many people have benefited from the years of slavery, and other people have suffered from the years of slavery. So that would be one example.
Well, you see, the question was, should an individual hold themselves accountable for collective wrongdoing of our leaders? So are individuals responsible for societal ills? As a general rule, I don't believe in, first of all, I'm opposed to collective punishment. And this seems like, I don't think groups of people should be punished for the wrongs of an individual, which, by the way, is accepted in some places. There are countries where if an individual commits a crime, the individual's family is punished. I'm opposed to collective punishment. But this is kind of the converse. Should an individual be punished for the wrongs of society? That seems to me to even be more problematic at a legal level. But if you're asking me, are we morally accountable? Let's take climate change. All of us in our society today materially benefit from climate change. We all enjoy lower prices because we have ridiculously low priced fossil fuels. Despite how high they are relative to where they were a couple of years ago, they're still ridiculously low priced. So at some kind of moral or political level, are we all accountable for that? And do we all need to address that in our own lives somehow, some way? I think, yeah, that's a really good point. I probably don't do enough of that. I hope that's the question.
Well, Peter Deutsch has actually replied to your question, and Peter's response is this. He says, "We are a government of the people. Then are we responsible for the actions of the government?"
All right, let's take some examples. Let's say our government engages in a military adventure and the leaders commit war crimes. They kill civilians in a way that violates the laws of war. They target civilians, which would be a violation of the laws of war. So should we as citizens of this government be punished for those war crimes? No, that would be collective punishment. No, the individuals who make those decisions are responsible. Let's take another example, however, and I'll go back to climate change. Let's say that we as a society institute a cap and trade policy on carbon, so that each of us who has benefited from hydrocarbon pollution and climate change financially, and we've done that as a society, individually and collectively. Now we have a system where the cost of that has to be borne by us through prices and taxation and so on. Yes. Let me give you a better example. In the 60s, cars were really powerful and fast, and wonderful cars were made. Jeffrey had a Pontiac Firebird that was the hottest thing in the world with a Hurst shifter, 4-speed, real hot rod. And there were lots of cars like that, but they were incredibly dangerous. And a guy named Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed that started a movement for safe cars. Our leaders had made a decision to not regulate the car industry, and that the economy and car profits and us having these hot rods was more important than people's lives. But the tide turned on that, and now car safety is a big part of government regulation. But cars are way, way more expensive than they used to be, and harder to acquire for the average person. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think when the cost of an economic activity like automobiles should be borne by the entire society that benefits from it, rather than there are victims who get injured and too bad for them, and then there are corporations that get rich and good for them. How's that for an answer?
That's a good one. Here's a question. Oh, I've got several good ones here. Steve Stanil asks, what do you think about artificial intelligence being judge, jury, and executioner as portrayed? I'm not sure as portrayed where, probably in some movies, but maybe we're moving in that direction. Have you any thoughts about that?
I've never given it serious thought, but the question itself frightens me. It seems to me utterly dystopian. My gut reaction is that that's horrifying. However,
okay,
I can see artificial intelligence being a type of scientific evidence that, if it's properly proven in a court, could be admissible. Let's say that some sort of artificial intelligence is involved in analyzing a crime scene and coming to a conclusion about whatever, the height and weight and description of a perpetrator, and that was reliable science and could be proven to be reliable. I would say that's admissible, but to actually judge the case, I don't know of anybody who would posit that artificial intelligence has a soul. And I think that's necessary to judge. Whatever a soul is, I don't claim to know that.
Okay. Paul David says, in Ireland, a common law jurisdiction like the US, we have non-jury trials for individuals involved in terrorism or gangland activity. He says that's known as the Special Criminal Court. Do you support non-jury trials?
That's a great question. I should tell you that there is a lawyer who has a podcast that I listen to regularly by the name of Rafe Foreman, and it's a podcast promoted by the Trial Lawyers College, to which I belong. And a few weeks ago, he had an Irish barrister on, and they spent an hour talking about the differences in the legal system, and especially the fact that in America, jury trials are far more widely available than they are in Ireland or the United Kingdom, where jury trials, which are the common law systems, originated and through which we got the institution of jury trials. The short answer to your question is, I believe in jury trials, and I think that the right to a jury trial should be widely protected in any action against an individual by the government in which that individual's property or liberty is at risk. So I'm a big believer in jury trials, and I don't like the way that the United Kingdom or Ireland have restricted that right. I don't trust government bureaucrats, no matter how learned, to make those decisions, because government bureaucrats, like all of us, suffer from confirmation bias and tend to protect the interests of the government by virtue of their position.
I have a question. I don't understand the question fully, but I think you might. And
Okay.
it's from Cyber Unato, who asks, what is your opinion of William Kunstler?
I understand the question very well. So William Kunstler was a great lawyer, a marvelous orator, who was famous for representing anti-war and leftist people in the 1960s and 70s. So you might remember the Chicago 8 trial with Judge Julius Hoffman in the 1970s, where Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, Bobby Seale, and others were on trial for conspiring to incite a riot at the 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention. And William Kunstler was a defense lawyer in that case. He was very much a movement lawyer. He believed that law should be, the way he practiced law was as a way of promoting his leftist anti-Vietnam War politics. He gave an incredible lecture, which is recorded, where he talked about some of the most horrible, let's call them crimes, some of the most horrible acts in human history were legal and were done through a legal process that, in terms of the letter of the law, were totally legal. And this is one of the most, in my view, important lectures ever given in the law. He pointed out that the crucifixion of Jesus was totally legal and Roman law was complied with, that the Holocaust was totally legal and it complied with the criminal and civil law of all of the sovereign nations in which it was committed. So I think William Kunstler was a brilliant lawyer, a brilliant orator. However, I am very mistrustful of the notion that the justice system should be used as a political vehicle. I have seen that done more often in favor of the powerful, in favor of institutions against the rights of the individual. Obviously, Mr. Kunstler was a civil libertarian, and I might favor him more, but I'm very suspicious of the mixture of justice and politics in general. But Kunstler was a great lawyer.
Okay, I had forgotten about William Kunstler, so I'm very glad for the question and more glad for the answer. I've got a question here from João Paulo Cabral, who says, hi, thanks for the interview. I want to ask Andrew's thoughts about the use of forensic hypnosis to obtain more concise evidence. And then he says, in the UFO field.
I, as a law student, was involved in a case where forensic hypnosis was used. I'll tell that story if I may. In Madison, Wisconsin, there was a horrible, well, first of all, I want to start by saying all of this is public information, widely reported in the newspaper, and none of this, other than one little thing I'm going to tell, is anything confidential. There was a horrible, atrocious rape and murder in Madison, Wisconsin, when I was in law school. And I can't remember the victim's name, but the circumstances of this rape and murder were utterly gruesome. I won't even speak of them here, but as horrifying as you can imagine. And there was a man charged with committing this by the name of Ralph Armstrong, who had been released from prison in Arizona for, I believe, I could be wrong about this, but I believe he had been convicted of rape in Arizona and gotten out of prison and come to Madison, Wisconsin. And witnesses saw that on the evening where this horrid event occurred, he was having dinner with the victim and a few other people at a Madison restaurant, and they, were rowdy and getting drunk, and then they had all left, and he had left with the victim. So he was the last person who was seen with her while she was alive. And then she was found brutally, we'll skip the details, but it was horrifying. So there was a woman by the name of Ricky Arabia who saw the murderer leave the apartment building. And Ricky was a prostitute, but she had been sitting on her front porch on a street in Madison at the time, but she had about 10 or 15, I'm not sure the number, but multiple prostitution charges pending against her. Back in those days, I don't think it's like this anymore, but back in those days, there was a lot of prostitution around the Capitol Square in Madison. So now we have this woman who's charged with lots of prostitution. She's also an eyewitness to an important event in the most gruesome murder in the history of Madison, Wisconsin. But she doesn't really remember it. So they used hypnotically enhanced forensic hypnosis to hypnotically enhance her recollection, or hypnotically get her recollection, bring about her recollection, however it's done. I'm not an expert on that. And there was significant litigation about whether or not that was forensically reliable and should be allowed in as evidence, and it was, and Ralph Armstrong was convicted. And he spent, I believe, over 35 years in prison. It was certainly a life. He was never going to get paroled. This was a horrifying case. But this case occurred in around 1980, something like that. And forensic technology advanced dramatically after he was convicted, including DNA technology, which didn't even exist at the time of the murder. And basically what happened was, as a result of DNA testing of the evidence, decades later, Ralph Armstrong was excluded, couldn't possibly have been the murderer. His DNA did not match the DNA that the murderer had left all over the crime scene. And it's likely that the murderer was actually his brother, who looked like him, who was deceased. And Ralph Armstrong, a few years ago, was finally released from prison. And I believe he sued people and won the lawsuit. So that's what I know about forensic hypnosis, is my personal experience with it. And I can tell you this, now I'm going to give you the confidential part. I represented, as a law student, Ricky Arabia, the witness, in her prostitution cases. And they went away quietly under the table because of her cooperation with the prosecution in the Armstrong murder. And it's not something I'm proud of. However, my law professors who were supervising me told me I had an ethical duty to represent my client, not worry about somebody else's client. So I did so.
Well, this is a very interesting case because from what you're telling me, the actual murderer looked a lot like the person that your client, Ricky Uribio, identified as the murderer. So it would seem in this particular instance, it's hard to say whether the hypnosis was detrimental or not.
I think that's fair.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a well conceived position on it. I'm just telling you my vignette, my story of what happened.
Okay.
The hypnotic recollection resulted in a very unjust conviction.
But even without hypnosis, it's likely the conviction would have been the same.
Without hypnosis, she would have been unable to make the identification. She had not enough conscious recollection to make those statements. Now, could it be that it wasn't so much so that the hypnosis was unreliable? It was just that these two guys looked alike. So her testimony was accurate. There was just somebody who looked very much like him. I guess that's a fair argument. That's eyewitness identification is extremely unreliable as a form of evidence in any event, and yet it's extremely persuasive under any circumstances, hypnosis or not.
Okay, well, to change the subject, I've got a question from Craig Burns, who says, did you think that the COVID laws were relevant? Now, he doesn't specify which COVID laws, and then he goes on to say, if so, what should have happened to the British government for breaking them? I have no idea what he means by that, but maybe you can.
I don't understand the question, and I would be interested to know what the question is about, because there is, I don't know if I should even go here, but I think a lot of people who oppose the COVID laws, and whether or not those laws were effective in controlling COVID, are subject to debate. But there's certainly arguments going around that suggest that those laws were part of some nefarious plot to control society and rob people of their individual rights. And I think that not only are those ideas wrong, but they are dangerous conspiratorial points of view that are promoted by people with antisocial agendas.
In other words, if I understand what you're saying, you think that it's legitimate for governments to institute laws that restrict human freedom, such as a law requiring people to wear face masks, or a law requiring restaurants or churches to restrict the number of people who enter, in regard to something like the general common benefit, such as a public health crisis.
I think it's not only legitimate, and it has been legitimate historically forever, but it's a fundamental duty of governments to do that. But those laws have to be, like all laws, have to be rationally based. A law that's utterly arbitrary and capricious can and often are challenged successfully in court. If a legislature or a government agency says, we have a problem, it's this disease, and we have to institute these protocols pursuant to these laws, and somebody comes into court and says there is no problem, and they can prove that, then the laws are invalid, and that's appropriate process. If I can be specific, as we all know, when that happened, and by the way, it goes back to the beginnings of this republic. George Washington required all of the soldiers in the Continental Army to be inoculated for smallpox. This is nothing new. When I was a child, it was the law. Every school child had to be vaccinated for polio. Nobody thought twice about it. Why is it controversial with this latest pandemic? I think is frankly because of, well, I'll come right up and say it. I've seen flyers and posters being circulated in my area of the world that claim that a nefarious cabal of Jews who secretly controlled the government and owned the pharmaceutical companies were trying to use this as a population control mechanism to suppress non-Jews and gain riches. And I think that kind of point of view is offensive and despicable, and every decent person should oppose it.
I've got a question here from Jim Hosier, who is also one of our volunteers. He asks, how do you feel about releasing convicted criminals who have only served a small portion of their sentence?
Paroled. In my home state, we don't have that anymore. Long ago, we instituted something called truth in sentencing, where there is no parole. What happens is if a person, let's say, gets a 3-year sentence, it means they have to serve the 3 years. If they behave badly and commit violations in prison, that sentence can be increased. Prior to that, a person would be given a sentence, let's say, of 10 years. And if they were on good behavior, they could earn an early release and get paroled. So I think when Wisconsin passed this reform of the way people were sentenced, the name of the law was called Truth in Sentencing. So the real function of it was not to keep people in prison longer, but just to make it honest, so that if the judge announced you're going to do 3 years, then that person knew, and the public in general knew that 3 years meant 3 years. And I think that's a good thing. What I don't agree with is a big problem in our society, which is mass incarceration. We are one of the most, if not the most, incarcerated countries on earth. The prison population in the United States as a percentage of the population is sky high. Maybe Russia's higher, maybe countries like North Korea are higher, but other than those kind of tyrannies, no other country in the world even remotely approaches the incarceration rate of the United States. And it's very disproportionately applied to people of color and the poor. And it has never been shown to deter crime. So the notion that prison as the first response to the social problem of crime is somehow effective in deterring crime is just false. It's contrary to all the data. And most of the crimes in this country that are committed, whatever they are committed by people who are one way or another addicted to drugs or alcohol. And that's the problem we have never squarely addressed.
Okay, well, we have 2 minutes left, Andrew. So at this point, I want to remind our viewers, if you aren't already a subscriber to the weekly newsletter of New Thinking Aloud, you can subscribe for free by going to New Thinking Aloud, all one word, and aloud is ALLOWED, .org, O-R-G. That'll take you to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website where you can subscribe for free to our newsletter, and you'll find a lot of other interesting information, including a few items for sale available on that website. And even for those who feel so motivated, opportunities to donate to our productions. But Andrew, I want to give you the last word. We've got a minute. Do you have a final thought?
I just, the questions were really astute. I'm just honored for the opportunity. Thank you for the questions. I hope I answered them. I want to say that there are many, many people in my profession who view this as an honorable calling and do everything we can to be honorable in the way we do it. And not only that, but to do it in a way where it's a vehicle to our own self-actualization. And if I make no other point than that, I just want to be grateful for the mentors and teachers who have brought me to this place in my life. I'm a lucky guy.
Well, I'm very delighted, Andrew, to be able to share you with the New Thinking Aloud audience. And of course, I'm very proud of you.
And not as proud as I am of you, John.
So I will end our live stream at this point. And I want to thank all of our listeners for being with us. And of course, the archival video will be available online. So thank you all, those of you who have been with us. And now I've got to open up all of the pages that I need to go to in order to end. So just give me a moment. And then, of course, as usual, I'll invite our moderators to okay, I'm having a little trouble here. Yeah. I should, okay, here we go.